Hello, everybody. If there's a word metaphor that we can use to describe Trumpian America, it may be bulldozer. I'm not sure if we use the verb or the adverb or the noun, but Trump is bulldozing everything and everyone, or at least trying to. Lots of people warned us about this. Perhaps nobody more than my guest today, Matthew Karp. He teaches at Princeton. He had an interesting piece in the January issue, actually this month's issue of Harper's, but I guess it was written probably in January, even December. Expect more bulldozings. And Matthew is joining us from Park Slope in Brooklyn. Matthew, is bulldozing or bulldozers, is that the right word? Is that our word of the month or of the year?
It does seem like it. I mean, this column is sort of more about the Democrats' electoral fortunes than Trump's war on the administrative state, but it seems to apply in a number of contexts, doesn't it?
When did you write it?
The lead times for these Harper's pieces are really far in advance. They have very trim kind of working order. So I wrote this almost right in the wake of the election in November, and then it maybe stretched on, some of the edits stretched on into December, but it's a kind of a review of the dynamics that brought Trump into office, and an assessment of the various interpretations that have been, proffered by different groups for why Trump won, why the Democrats lost.
Yeah, you begin with an interesting half joke on, given the victory of Trump, the clear victory, maybe we should use the classic Brechtian proposal to dissolve the people and elect another. You say that there are some writers like Jill Filipovich, who has been on the show, and Rebecca Solnit, who everybody knows. There's a lot of hand-wringing, soul-searching on the left these days, Matthew, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what defeat does to you. And in some ways, that impulse to sort of essentially blame the people, not the politicians. There was a lot of that talk went alongside these sort of insistences that, like, Kamala Harris ran a flawless campaign. That was a prime adjective, flawless. I mean, this has been a feature of it, in particular, Democratic Party politics for a while. It certainly appeared in 2016. And I don't think it's actually the majority view this time around, but that faction was out there again.
Yeah, it's another interesting word, flawless. I've argued many times, both on the show and privately, that she ran, or I'm not sure if the word ran is the right word. She misrun, or people around her misrun a deeply flawed campaign. You seem to agree, although I think you perhaps might suggest that there's some structural elements there. What's your analysis 3 months after the defeat, as the dust is settled, Matt?
It doesn't feel like the dust is settled. I'm writing my piece now about these early days of the Trump administration, and actually, I was just writing about it. It feels like a dust cloud. It feels like we can barely see because the headline dust is constantly in our eyes. But yeah, looking back on the election anyway, there are a number of things to say, but I think the sort of broader trend here, which I do think is larger than Harris's sort of particular moves as a candidate or her particular qualities and deficits as a candidate, has to do with the Democratic Party as a sort of a national. I mean, I don't like the word brand. We all have to speak as if we're marketers now. Like, I sort of resist that. But the Democratic Party as a national symbol, or as an entity, or how it exists in the minds of voters, because since Obama in particular, and this is an even longer running trend, but in particular over the last 10, 15 years, the Democratic Party's fortunes have really nosedived with voters making less money, getting less education, voters in lower class, working class, lower middle class positions, measured by any way you slice it sociologically. And this is not only, as you know, a kind of historic reversal from what was once the party of Roosevelt, in which, Joe Biden tried to bring Roosevelt back. He had that giant picture of Roosevelt behind him on the White House.
Yeah, this is FDR rather than Teddy, of course.
Exactly, FDR, yeah. The icon of the party. But and in those days, of course, the Democrats won overwhelmingly with the organized and unionized working class, but also broadly with blue collar workers, with workers of all sorts of races and ethnicities who were working class. That began to change over the course of the 20th century a lot. The party of Clinton was already a different kind of party. And yet, even still then, Democrats at their peak were capable of winning large, even majorities of non-college educated and workers making, sort of in the bottom 50th percentile of the distribution income-wise. And this party, especially since 2012 or so, has really been moving rapidly in the other direction. I mean, we talk about it, political scientists and others talk about, class de-alignment, the way in which, for a long time, there essentially is no class alignment between the parties these days. If anything, there's probably a stronger case for the Republicans to be more of a working class party just from their coalition, although I think that's overstated too. But from the Democratic perspective, it's just what's so striking is that trend, the slipping away, the out-migration of all these voters away from Democrats, especially in national elections, in presidential elections.
You put it very nicely, I thought, in the piece. I'm quoting you. The fault is not in the Democrats' campaigns, it's in themselves. And, some people might disagree on the word fault. And then you write, and I think this is the really important sentence. This is a party that represents the nerve center of American capitalism, ideological production, and imperial power. Now, some people might suggest, well, what's wrong with that? America should be proud of its capitalism, its imperial power, its ideological production. I think you might disagree. But the odd thing, Matt, that's so surreal, so jarring about all this is that Democrats don't acknowledge that. As you say, that's the reality. You can see it in Harris. You can see it in her husband. You can see it in San Francisco and in Park Slope, Brooklyn, where you live. You can see it in Princeton. You can see it in Manhattan. It's so self-evident. And yet no one is willing to actually acknowledge this. What's going on?
Yeah, it's a good point, Andrew. I mean, I
wonder your point. I'm just riffing off your point.
No, I know, but the point about the acknowledgement, it's interesting to think about it that way. Because I wonder if a sort of a more candid sort of piece of self-recognition would maybe benefit the party. I don't know. I mean, I think some of it is there's a deep-seated need going back to that, kind of tradition of FDR and so on, and especially on the part of the sort of left wing of the party, anyone who's even halfway progressive, to feel like this is the party of, the sort of the little guy against the big guy, the party of marginalized people, the party of justice for all, not just for the powerful. And that sort of felt need, is greater than and transcends the statistics, tallied up in voting returns. And I think for the sort of the media and institutional sort of staff complex of the Democratic Party, which includes a lot of the politicians now, that reality will still be a reality, even if the facts on the ground have changed. So some of it is, I think, a genuine kind of refusal to see what's in front of you. That's not sort of hypocritical, because that implies that it would be, willfully misleading. Whereas I think that's actually less the problem. I think it is a sort of a deeper ideological thing for many people. I mean, the other thing is there's other people who would be able to acknowledge that, and yet are just still feel like it would be electoral, it would not help the party to sort of celebrate that fact. So they are involved in a kind of cover-up process, and a sort of a whitewashing where you make public statements in one direction. There was a lot of populism or so-called populism in the Harris campaign about, you gotta tax the rich, or you gotta, I'm not rich as hell, but then you quietly reassure all of your points of contact with Wall Street, with Silicon Valley, et cetera, that nothing's really going to change. I mean, that was Joe Biden's famous line in 2020. And I do think that strategy has come with electoral costs. So maybe there will be a rethinking on that front.
But is it just cyclical? The FDR cycle, Great Society, New Deal, LBJ, all the rest of it's just come to an end. And the ideology hasn't caught up with it. And Democrats still see themselves as radical, but they're not. They're actually deeply conservative. I've had so many conversations with people who think of themselves as being progressives and say to me, I used to think I'm a progressive in the context of Trump or some other populist, but now I realize I'm a conservative. And none of them kind of recognize the broader historical meaning. The irony of all this is that they actually are conservative. They're for the status quo. That was clear in the last election. Harris, for better or worse, celebrated the old America, and Trump had a vision of a new America, for better or worse. And yet no one was really willing to acknowledge this, put it into words.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think there's institutionally, socially, the Democrats have become the party of the status quo that, for whom, I mean, people on the left constantly lambast, and I've done this, Democrats for lacking a kind of bold reform agenda. But yeah, that's sort of not the point. I mean, look, some people will say, oh, just to address the sort of potential counter arguments to this, some people will say, oh, Joe Biden was the most progressive president since FDR, because he spent a lot of money on, infrastructure programs and so on. But I guess my view is that that kind of enhanced government spending, which did increase the federal budget, as a share of GDP to levels that were, that are significant, nevertheless didn't actually, I mean, there isn't a single reform program that you can identify and attach to Joe Biden's name, unlike all of these, progressive Democratic presidents past. There isn't, even Obama had Obamacare. It's not really clear what Joe Biden's legacy is, other than essentially increasing the budget. And none of those programs, none of that spending, it turns out, did anything to improve his political popularity, because the money was so diffuse, or in other cases, it was so targeted that it went to build this one, chip plant in one town in Ohio. And if you didn't happen to be in that county in Ohio, in one of the other of 87 of Ohio's 88 counties, it made no difference to you. So there wasn't anything like, a sort of a healthcare reform or a structural, family leave reform, a childcare reform, something that somebody could say, hey, wait a minute, this is a party, this is a president that's actually changed the way that my life, operates for the better. That there was nothing broad-based like that. And yeah, that's unfortunate. So I totally agree with your characterization. I'm just sort of bringing up, I can just hear little voices in my head saying, but Biden this, but Biden that.
Yeah, and I think to continue the Brechtian metaphor, the approach of the Biden people, and of Biden in particular, although one wonders about his grasp on reality at the best of times, was his attitude was rather like a parent giving a child a lovely, what in their mind was a lovely Christmas present, and then the child smashing it up or not acknowledging it. It was as if the American electorate didn't get what Biden and his people had given them, and that they were somehow ungrateful.
Yeah, you had the specter of these, even people that I would have rated as fairly left-wing economists. I think Dean Baker, other people I've been reading for years, kind of really kind of lashing themselves to the mast of, this election is, this is a good economy. The economy is better than it's ever been. It's especially a good economy for working people. Here's a chart that says so. I don't care how you feel about it. I don't care if, in fact, your feelings are irrelevant in the face of these facts. And that seems to be so obviously brain dead that you would need to sort of lobotomize everyone politically, that is, anyone who even had that thought that we're going to go to war with this idea. And yet they sort of never really gave it up. The Harris campaign never, totally gave it up. It was a sort of, at least a part of a feature of how, you never had it so good. And yeah, I think it can only be attributed to what you say, Andrew, that at the end of the day, on a lot of levels, this fear of a rowdy, unpredictable populist right is so much greater than any positive vision for what they want to do, that the sort of the conservative impulses predominate. And so that just means, as even if you recognize intellectually that the status quo is flawed, and you have these various progressive commitments, and it's an outrage that we don't have universal health care and yada, 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 you still are so much more disturbed by the prospect of Trump that you are willing to sort of throw the rest of that by the wayside. Not to mention the very real material connections between this party and lots of forces that don't want a sweeping social democratic reform.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, both Biden. I mean, the only thing that Biden and Harris were running on was being against Trump. Had Biden won, of course, Harris lost on that. There's, as you suggest, there's an ancien regime quality. You're a historian to all this. Is that the old regime just doesn't get it? They just buy their own. I don't know whether you call it lies or ideology or fetishes, and it's a classic historical phenomenon, isn't it? The old regime never quite gets it, Matthew.
Yeah. And I wonder, I mean, I've been trying to interpret, along with many others, like, how do you explain the sort of relative quiescence of some of the sort of the broader, not just the progressive left, but the Democratic Party in the face of this sort of blizzard of the last couple of weeks. And I do think I have this very, probably unpopular and I don't know, probably implausible, semi-implausible sort of opinion that this quiescence is actually there's something positive in that it does reflect some kind of wrestling with what we did wrong, even if they can't say that out loud. I'm not sort of saying that
you can say it out loud on my show. I think.
Yeah, I'm not optimistic that in 2026 the party's going to like have figured it out in any real sense. But I think the sort of impulse to sort of actually swallow a bit, even in the face of a lot of shock and awe from the Trump administration, is not a wholly unhealthy one, because there does need to be a conceptual reckoning with what the broad base of Americans, what they want from their politics and what they see and what Democrats have historically been offering to them. And so just jumping back to the barricades as if it's 2017 all over again, I don't think would represent a healthy political impulse.
Yeah, and coming out with one more machine politician from some Midwestern state or a coastal state would be pointless. So if the old regime doesn't get it, you suggest in your article that the working class does. You perhaps follow Marx in fetishizing the working class, suggesting that they understand reality better than the bourgeoisie. And that's why you suggest, although maybe you don't quite suggest it, but I thought you did, that's why they voted for Trump, because in the old Marxian narrative, discourse, ideology, the working class understand history better than the old regime, and they understand and so you suggest that's why they voted for Trump. Is that wrong?
I mean, I wouldn't, Marxian as I may be,
well, you do quote him in the article. That's why.
No, absolutely. No. And it's fair. And I do think with him a lot, but I wouldn't share his sort of rippling confidence in the proletariat as the gravediggers of capitalism at this point. I wish I could, honestly. Nevertheless, I do think that in that particular.
Sorry to interrupt, Matthew. I didn't mean that. What I meant was. What I meant in your piece was that the working class understands reality. They may not want to destroy capitalism, but they understand what's happening. So they saw through Hillary Clinton, Dick Cheney, Mark Cuban, Bill Kristol, and Beyonce. They saw through the whole circus of the Kamala Harris thing, and that's why a lot of them voted for Trump.
Yeah, no, I think there's some, I still think that if you look at the numbers, there's a really quite vivid numerical argument for this. If you just look at the sort of essentially the decline in participation from a huge chunk of Democratic leaning districts, whether they were in Brooklyn, in my own borough, in Sunset Park, and places like that, which saw huge swings to Trump. Some of that were people sort of switching sides. A lot of it were people who voted for Biden and just didn't vote this time around. You saw that in swing states too, and in lots of places, the sort of the numbers just essentially drooped. And I think it also works in if you look at the sort of polling and my assessment of like what voters wanted. I think it's clear that they didn't want the Democrats more than they did want Trump and his agenda. So, if you even look at the polls today in this kind of Trump in his invincible honeymoon phase, he's still struggling to crack. He's under 50% in all the averages that I've seen. He's struggling to, break that waterline.
I heard on one show yesterday, I heard he was above 50, but he's around the 50%.
I think he's had a couple solo polls, but if you look at the Real Clear Politics or 538, he's still the average is still below. He's only plus 1 or 2, 3% right now. And, this is normally presidents at this period have, Biden himself, in our polarized era, he was plus 18 in February of 21. I was just looking this up. There were more people who actually did want Biden that relatively recently. I think Trump was elected because people didn't want the Democrats. They didn't want the smugness attached to where the economy is versus how the economy felt. And they didn't want, I think they didn't want this sense of this party that occupied all of these positions of cultural, institutional, and yes, economic power. And, by the way, I did an earlier column about this, looking at sort of different sort of lines and structures of power in American society. Democrats also heavily preponderant these days in the national security state, in terms of the war in Ukraine, in terms of the sort of America's military alliances globally, in terms of all sorts of the sort of national intelligence community. This is a party that occupied, and still occupies, I think, institutionally, all of these kind of major structural bases of power. And yet, and the one place that they've been vulnerable, essentially the most vulnerable place. And I don't think Trump is going to change this. I don't think his Elon Musk's federal purge of federal workers is going to change democratic cultural power, democratic power in the security state, democratic sort of institutional power. I think is still going to be with us. But the one place where they're vulnerable is on election day at the ballot box, especially when more people vote. There is a sort of a reluctance on the part, especially on the part of workers, to sort of totally endorse this party and its program, which I think, and I guess the bit that I feel like people got, even if they, some of them did love Trump, some of them were more ambivalent, but I think the part that they got is what you were saying earlier, that this is a party that doesn't really want to change anything. This is a party that is comfortable with itself and how things are right now. And I think a lot of Americans weren't. I think, what?
Yeah, and to borrow, to go back to Marx, who's always good on these sorts of things. I mean, the reason is obvious, is because for the people of Park Slope or San Francisco or Manhattan or Princeton, America is fine. I mean, you had an interesting YouTube series I was watching on the death of the American dream. I was watching it before we went live. What happened to the American dream? And you talk about the collapse on every front in terms of healthcare and death and income inequality. But not all Democrats, but many Democrats simply don't. It's not that they don't get it. They're living well. They're living as well as they've ever lived.
Yeah, and I think, whatever you would say about Trump, and I don't think his agenda gained broad popularity. I said that in the piece. I continue to believe that, even if, even the polling on things that's really popular, like, some of the stuff about the border, getting control over the border is very popular. But what to do about immigrants currently in the country, it really depends on how you word it. But what people did feel about what Trump stood for is that he stood for doing things. He stood for motion and change and shaking things up. He stood for that. That's why he's so much more successful as a challenger than as an incumbent, because that's what he stood for in 2016 against a similarly complacent Democratic Party in Hillary Clinton taking the baton from Barack Obama. He stood for, I remember people talking about this in 2016. It's a key the car election. Sometimes, you see a fancy car, you just want to, slash at it with a metal key. And I think a lot of people did that. And some people thought that would never happen again, because then the experience of Trump in power, was not one that most people liked. And so Biden comes in. But then he's out of power for 4 years. He's prosecuted to the full extent of the law. He becomes a rebel and an insurgent and a sort of a vector of potential change again. And what do you know? People want to key the car all over again. It does feel like we're in this sort of doom loop and cycle where, because I also believe that he's going to make himself unpopular again relatively soon, and he'll be thrown out. And I mean, God willing, he won't come back again. But I do feel like none of these things actually sort of change the reality that produces this cycle.
Yeah, and as you note in a tweet, the Democrats are what you call politically pathetic, and I don't know whether that suggests that they're prisoners of politics, they just don't get it, or that the problem is with the coastal elites, and that there needs to be a new kind of Democrat. In your piece, you write about someone called Dan Osborne, an independent union steam fitter, was running for Senate in Nebraska. Looks like an interesting character. He didn't win, but he did pretty well. Guys like Osborne for you, are they the fix here, the solution, a new way of thinking about America, perhaps in some ways learning from right-wing populism, a new populism of the left?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think they're a silver bullet. I think there's a lot of institutional and sort of social obstacles to reconstituting some kind of 19th century style or mid 20th century style working class project, whether it's organized in labor unions or in mass parties of the left. There's a lot that's just different about this world, and we should be clear-eyed about that. That being said, I think the Osborne campaign absolutely represents an electoral road forward here for people who do want real change. He wildly outperformed not just Kamala Harris, the other Democrat running for Senate against the other Republican senator at the same time. And his margins were highest precisely in the places where Democrats have struggled the most and where they need to do best. In the sort of wealthy suburban districts around Omaha, where Harris actually won, Osborne more or less like held serve, but he didn't really run ahead of her at all in those places. There were a lot of people, there were more than a few, having actually talked a little bit since the election. I had a chance to talk to Dan for a little bit, and I talked to a few of the other people in the Osborne campaign. You know, there were a fair amount of people who voted for Kamala and for, according to their numbers, and for the Republican senator, Deb Fischer, in these kind of suburban districts. These are the sort of new voters that Democrats are winning at some level, who believe in split tickets and are kind of the Liz Cheney-esque kind of voter. But where Osborne really ran up the score was further out in rural areas, among workers. I think we don't have exactly the numbers, but I would bet a lot of money that he way overperformed with voters with lower educations and lower incomes. And yeah, it wasn't enough to win because Nebraska is a plus 20 Republican state, and so you'd need to you need to flip the world on its head to actually win as a Democrat, or as a non-Republican rather, there. Because I think running as an independent obviously mattered. But his style of politics, I think, can appeal in lots of districts, not just Nebraska, in all sorts of places. I mean, and there are some sort of heterodox Democrats that sometimes are grouped as real conservatives and aren't friends of the left. Sometimes they take swings at the left. I'm thinking of a guy like Jared Golden in Maine, who also won re-election in a very Trumpy district, but shares some of the same political energy as Osborne. He's much more willing to sort of attack economic elites, both within the Democratic and the Republican cultural orbit. That is, not just the bad oil billionaires, but also the sort of the good, friendly Wall Street billionaires who donate a lot of their money to the art gallery. The people who appear at Democratic fundraisers, and I think that sort of populist leverage or positioning is something that registers with people, because they're like, wait a minute, they're naming the forces that actually hold power in this economy. I think people get that the people implicitly, and yeah, sure, a lot of Americans don't hate billionaires, they want to be billionaires, yada yada yada. It's not so simple, but there is a large number of working people who recognize where power lies and see that power is essentially arraigned against them, or at least against change, and see that and they want to vote for someone who is throwing themselves against those forces.
Right. I mean, as you say, the American, if there's such a thing as an American working class, they're not as stupid as the Harris people thought they were. When Harris appears on stage with Liz Cheney, the epitome of the Cold Warrior, that they see through it. You had a couple of interesting pieces, one on Jamal Bowman's defeat in Scarsdale, and another where you appeared with Thomas Frank on the classic American populist on another show. Frank has sometimes been accused, if not of racism, certainly of being a kind of conservative populist, even if he sees himself from the left. Is a lot of the arguments are one of the reasons why the Democratic Party has lost the support of much of the American working class? Can it be attributed to cultural politics, to the new left victory in the 60s and its control of the Democratic agenda, which is really manifested in many ways by somebody like Kamala Harris, a wealthy lawyer running as a member of the the diverse underclass.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they made such an effort in the convention to sort of demonstrate Harris's working class credentials, that she was at this rough kindergarten and and she,
in
was
Berkeley of all places, right?
Exactly, in Berkeley, where her parents were professors at Stanford and so on. So, although her father is a really interesting left-wing economist, but that's another subject. Yeah, I think. Look, I don't want to. I'm not somebody who thinks that the Democrats lost because of woke, and this whole election was about some backlash to DEI. I think there were larger issues in play, and the principal one is this economic question. But I also think you can't actually separate those issues, because I think what people have intuited is that the Democrats have become a party that has retained, if anything, sort of advanced this sort of cultural liberalism coming out of the new left, not shorn of some of its radicalism, but nevertheless kind of as recently as 2020, there was a very new left-like insurgency of street protests and marches, and sort of focused on police brutality, focused on structural racism. Anyway, the left has sort of not just the left, the Democrats have kind of imbibed, incorporated, made nice, kind of stamped as part of their identity much of those kind of cultural questions, whether they're about usually involving the sort of protection, the defense, the enhancement of some vulnerable minority group, whether that be racial, sexual, gender-based, etc. And I don't actually think that Americans are, broadly hostile to civil rights, equality, and in substance, a lot of the Democratic positions on those issues, or even left-wing positions on those issues. But I think when you essentially hollow out your party's historic core connection to the working class and to economic reform and to economic equality, and you sort of in 100 different ways, from Clinton to Obama, including even Biden, kind of take so much off the table in terms of working class politics, and you do stitch your mask to, we are the party of democracy and we are the party of essentially the protection of vulnerable minorities in a cultural sense, then it's no wonder that a lot of people come to think that these minority populations are essentially they're essentially the clients of very powerful patrons. The Ford Foundation, all of this foundation money that goes to sort of supporting what we would call culturally left causes is propped up by lots of billionaire money. That's sort of a fact. And I think for the Democrats to sort of adopt a lot of that, the sort of almost, I don't want to say unthinkingly, but in a way that it's not really even a debate in the party. You can't even really have a debate about something like trans rights in the party, because it's not a live issue. It has to all happen backstage, and then some position is kind of unveiled, and no one can really debate it.
But, and lots of stuff's been written on this. I mean, books and a whole. I'm sure you're in a university, you know this better than I do. But the left in this country, they're unable to argue. I mean, they're unable to disagree. I mean, whatever you think about Trump, at least he can argue. He can deal with people who disagree with him. That's why Harris didn't go on the Rogan show, because she can't deal. And she's a symbol of this. She can't deal with people who disagree with her.
She wouldn't even have had to argue on that show. It would have just been shooting the shit. But that was part of her weakness, that they felt they were so conservative. They felt like they couldn't even avoid kind of her to be unscripted for extended periods, because it would be seized upon. But yeah, I do think that that's a problem. And I think not even just argue with the right, like the left can't argue with the right. I don't know. I think on some issues that's overstated. But on terms of this cultural and economic question, I think what's interesting is that there's been so few intra-democratic arguments about some of these issues. Like, it's become the moral, and actually a very left-wing scholar by the name of Wendy Brown wrote about this 25 years ago, about how with certain frontiers of universal, like the old communist dream of universal equality, in some ways removed from the table, left-wing politics has inevitably kind of recurred backwards towards a politics of grievance and victimization and kind of an intense moralism that means that, that finds it difficult to sort of brook disagreement without it being seen as, okay, well, you're in the enemy now. And, I've seen this internally. So I do think that is notable, that there's a lack of argument.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole school. I mean, Daniel Bell, Christopher Lasch, they all wrote about this 50 years ago. and it comes back to your argument that that the Democrats are the party that represent the nerve center of American capitalism, which should theoretically put them in a strong position, but it puts them in an oddly weak position because for one reason or other, they won't acknowledge them.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, to sort of connect the cultural and the economic again, maybe to restate what I said, but I want to clarify the point. I mean, I think that voters, I think that what pisses voters off the most is when you are adopting, as we've talked about, this kind of mantra of progressive energy and attached to certain, you know, like really ironclad commitments to certain particular communities. You know, that whatever we could, you know, debate some of these positions, but it's just very clear where the Democrats stood on all of these issues when it comes to sort of, you know, culture. When it comes to sort of minority communities, when it comes to things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. No Democrat was criticizing that stuff. It was very clear where everybody stood, but it was really unclear what they would actually do materially. Maybe they would do a tax credit here. Maybe there would be an extension of, you know, the big debate. Bernie was pushing Joe Biden, you know, whipping him like a jockey coming down the home stretch to try to include hearing in Medicaid, and he couldn't even get that. You know, hearing and vision. I mean, these are really minor things, but at least they would be sort of something. And that stuff doesn't even exist. What you do get is a lot of spending on green energy, which is, yes, economic, but it also reflects clearly a kind of cultural, a sort of moral commitment about surrounding climate change that is not understood, and I think fairly understood, as a sort of investment in people's everyday lives.
Matt, you had a good quote where you suggested that Trump voters aren't these white right-wing racist reactionaries or even white working class voters. They're what you call Dominican hairstylists, Chinese grandmas, and Navajo teenagers.
I didn't see that. Where is that cited, Andrew? I missed that one. Is that some?
That was on Karp, but the tweet was from November of the day after the election. It got a lot of views. So how do the Democrats win these people back? How do they win back the Dominican hairstylists, the Chinese grandmas, the Navajo teenagers, if they're going to be honest? As I said, you had this interesting YouTube video, which I think was sponsored by Jacobin, the left-wing newspaper or online newspaper. What happened to the American dream? My takeaway from that was that you were presenting Denmark. It's the old, it always comes down to Denmark. If only America could be more like Denmark, then we can resurrect the American dream. Is that what will win back Dominican hairstylists, Chinese grandmas, and Navajo teenagers, Matt, if America becomes more like Denmark and rebuilds its welfare state?
I mean, I think that's not the 30-second ad that I would want to run in Navajo country. But I think if you're looking at, I mean, I don't know. This is small. This is really small. But I saw a quote today from Trump's Interior Secretary, Doug Burgum, who was talking about like, well, when Americans go, everyone goes on vacation and they're like, wow, this place is amazing. I mean, he's obviously talking about Europe. And, you know, look, you can walk everywhere and look, these things, all the buses and the trains run and everything's great. And then they come home and they're like, anyway, that happened. I do actually think that you wouldn't want to pitch it as Denmark, but a rebuilding of American institutions and the sort of infrastructure in a real way, not targeted, not pitched, you know, in a as a sort of a climate issue, certainly not pitched as a sort of racial, any kind of racial or minority community protection issue, but as a universalistic project about actually strengthening America's core infrastructure, and in a way that does, yes, look like Europe, including its sort of health and educational infrastructure, making it easier for Americans to have children, making it easier for Americans to raise families. There's a way to actually talk a lot about these issues that overlaps with popular thinking on the right, that and I'm not suggesting some sort of bipartisan arrangement between Bernie Sanders and J.D. Vance, but I am saying that there's a reason that kind of talk registers with people. And there's no reason why the left can't mobilize that, at least programmatically or ideologically. Somebody like Osborne, for even even at the same level, it's possible to expand the state in some areas and contract it in others, right? Think about AMLO in Mexico, probably the most successful left-wing politician of this century, maybe him and Lula. And AMLO has made a big deal about this thing called Republican austerity. He has not actually wildly expanded the budget. Joe Biden spent more than him, but relative to his predecessors. But he has redistributed and recalibrated that budget. He's taken out a lot of the sort of neoliberal reforms that he has styled corruption, and a lot of these private-public contracts, et cetera. And he's re-engineered some of that money towards towards Mexican workers and towards the working classes. And I think people feel that. Same thing with Lula. He had the Bolsa Familia, the sort of money that went directly to families. And I think, I'm not suggesting that universal basic income is the thing, because I think that's a sort of a kooky lefty idea, but there are welfareist policies that are super popular that can be branded not as, oh, this is some sort of, airy-fairy Nordic social democracy thing, but is actually a pro-family, a pro-worker, a pro-American, sensibility around this stuff that you can easily, connect to a lot of traditional values and a lot of nationalistic, patriotic sentiment. It's the sort of easiest thing in the world, at least ideologically, to imagine that formulation. What it would run afoul of is a lot of entrenched, institutional connections within the Democratic Party and even broadly on the left within the sort of, NGO world, within academia and the media class and so on, who are attached to the current structure of things. But I don't see why there's inherently a kind of ideological or a political problem with that program. To me, that seems like clearly the winning program, some kind of synthesis on those grounds.
Finally, Matt, and have to get you back on the show. There's so much here. It'd be interesting to see how this all plays out over the next 4 years, certainly of Trump 2.0. But is there an opportunity in a structural sense? I mean, you're still presenting the old America, a federal state, but the Trump people, for better or worse, are cutting this. They're attacking it on lots of levels. Are there really radical ideas, maybe not traditional left-wing ideas or even progressive ideas, certainly associated with technology? You talked about the universal income, AI, decentralization, even what out here we call Web3, which might revitalize progressives in the 21st century, or is that simply unrealistic?
Well, I think we've got to keep our eyes open. I mean, I think my little faction of the sort of dissident left, if you will, is often accused of kind of being overly nostalgic by, opponents on the left. And I guess I do want to say that at least internally, I have had good debates with a lot of left-wing people about this. That's not the same as the Democratic Party having open debates, but I do think there still remains, at least in some corners of the left, not Twitter, but in some corners of the left, a lively ability to discuss some of these issues. And I take the criticism that the vision that I've just laid out for you is sometimes can risk towards the nostalgic, towards, the sort of the middle decades of the 20th century when, union density was a lot higher, industrial America was a lot stronger, and you had healthy families and good jobs and there were a lot of problems with that vision. I recognize that, and it would never be a return to those cultural norms of Jim Crow, for instance. Obviously not. And B, you just can't rewrite the tape, run the tape backward like that. Technology has changed, culture has changed. These things are irrevocable. So I do think we need to sort of keep our eyes open. I'm very leery of technological quick fixes of, I don't know, the crypto left, if there is one, or something like that. That the blockchain is gonna resurrect socialism. I don't see that. I do think there is a political opportunity, though, that I've just laid out it is heterodox in the sense that it would represent a kind of a more conscious break with the liberal leftism that has sort of been in the water of the Democratic Party and of the progressive left since 1968, since the New Left, that would, kind of move away from this sort of championship of these small groups and towards a sort of a more universal, family-centered, country-centered. I do think that needs to be embraced with. I think that the current is flowing. The historic currents are flowing towards the nation state and not towards the globe. So I'm okay with a kind of a tariff politics. I'm okay with a kind of a celebration of the national. I'm okay to some extent with this impulse to get control of the border. That doesn't mean mass deportations, but it does mean having some actual understanding of who is coming and who is going into the country, and some rules about that, some orderly procedure. Every other country in the world, certainly including those lefty social democracies, has that. So I don't think that that's crazy, and I don't see why, you know, the left couldn't get behind that either. This is the nation state is the container in which these politics are sorted out. So we want to fight to win control over that nation state. We can't just pretend that we are, you know, floating in the globe somewhere. AMLO hasn't done that. Lula hasn't done that. The actually successful left-wing leaders have all been nationalists of one kind or another. So anyway, that's the kind of way that I would sort of look, rather than towards techno stuff. But at the same time, I don't want to be dogmatic, and I'm not as educated on some of the tech stuff as you might be. So I don't know.
And does it require, will it require some star power, some sizzle? I mean, yeah. I'm not sure any of us have the stomach for another white male Midwestern governor or senator.
I do think
not Bernie. Obviously, his shelf life is over for
you know,
a
he's
while.
Still
AOC in particular comes to mind, or somebody from out of the entertainment complex, Mark Cuban or somebody like that.
You know, Bernie still, I got to stand Bernie still, because he is still the most popular politician in America. He's managed to be that way for like a decade. But no, he's not the answer going forward. But I'm not against, I was talking about this with Bhaskar Sankara, the editor of the sort of founder of Jacobin and the president of the nation. And yeah, he openly said, and I agree with him, that, you know, celebrity Hail Marys are not to be looked on with contempt, right? So I do think we need some sizzle. I don't think that any of the existing governors, nor the sort of squad style progressives who are just way too heavily branded with all the baggage of this post 68 left to ever win nationally. I don't think AOC can do that, barring some kind of major pivot. But I do think that we have to be open, and we should be thinking about The Rock and other people like that. I'm not against that stuff.
So we need some bulldozing from the left, according to Matthew Karp, author of Expect More Bulldozings, teaches history at Princeton. Interesting conversation, Matthew. We'll get you back on the show, because this issue is certainly not going away. Thank you.